And a very warm welcome to this edition of Roundtable from me, David Foster. You know, never before have so many lost their jobs in such a short period of time. There are those who do say that a bounce back could be rapid too, but the workplace has probably changed forever, for better or for worse. Home working, as I am doing today, supply chains brought closer to home, a tech revolution, not evolution. There's also a generation just starting that has no idea what the working world will look like, or even if there'll be any jobs to have.
As the world suffers its biggest health crisis in 100 years, another crisis is unfolding, which could have an even longer lasting impact. Mass unemployment is becoming a threat all around the globe. The International Labour Organization has predicted cutbacks equivalent to nearly 200 million people in just 3 months. According to official figures, the US economy lost over 20 million jobs in April. The unemployment rate jumped to 14.7%, the worst since the Great Depression. The UK's Office for National Statistics says claims for out-of-work benefit rose by 69% in April. New graduates are losing their hopes of finding dream jobs, perhaps any jobs at all. The pandemic has forced rapid change in some sectors, mainly through technology and remote working. But what can governments do to save workers from the worst effects of this job crisis?
Well, very soon we'll be hearing from a labour market expert, that is Ahu Yildirmaz from the research group ADP, and from a company boss, Mark McDermott, chief exec of digital signage startup Screencloud. But first, let's say hello to Gulcin Ozkan, a professor of finance at King's College Business School, and Steve Coulter, visiting fellow and researcher in political economics at the London School of Economics. Great to have you on the programme. We'll show some figures in a moment from the United States that demonstrate just how severe this is. But first of all, let me ask you, if I may, Gulcin, do you think the job losses are there for the long term?
Obviously, it's not very easy to come up with very definitive ideas. But if we look at what has happened in the past, I think when we observe sharp rises in unemployment, they tend to stay in place for a long period of time. We've seen that in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. For the US, it took about 5 years to reverse back to pre-crisis levels of unemployment. In the EU, it was even worse. It took the EU about 11 years to get back to where it was before the crisis. Even in the UK, where employment outcomes were better, this came at the expense of job insecurity and very, very low real wage growth. So on the basis of those numbers, it's not looking great.
Steve, the last recession, 2008, was caused by economic foundations being wholly unsatisfactory. This one isn't because of that. If COVID goes away, if there's a vaccine, then surely the conditions are there for a rapid economic recovery and more jobs, or not?
It all really hinges on how quickly we can find a medical resolution to this. If we can relatively quickly, then there's a chance that the recession will be a V-shaped recession, albeit a very deep one. There's quite a lot of pent-up demand in some countries, such as the UK. I mean, one of the few really good interventions that the UK government has done is to preserve wages and jobs. So that will help cushion the labour market impact. Other countries have done the same. So if we get a relatively rapid medical resolution and not too much long-term structural damage is done, then we could see a relatively quick economic bounce back. And by quick, I mean 2 or 3 years or so. So it's not going to be imminent. If the medical response takes a lot longer and we have a sort of U or L-shaped recession, then permanent structural damage will be done to the labour market. Technology will be lost, human capital will be lost, a lot of otherwise very viable businesses will be lost, there'll be massive uncertainty, consumer behaviour will change, People will simply not want to go to bars or restaurants again. So there will be massive long-term structural damage to the economy. And then you get what's called labour market hysteresis, which is where people's skills and attitudes ossify. And so even when demand does return to the economy, it can take a long time before the skill sets are there for the labour market to return to normal and take advantage of this.
Gulcin and Steve, I'm going to put some figures up on the screen from the US Department of Labour, May the 8th this was. March unemployment rate, 4.4%, under 5%. 20 million jobs were lost in the US in April, and the unemployment rate for that month, 14.7%. Worst hit, Black Americans at 16.7%, and Hispanics, 18.9%. In 1933, time of the Great Depression, unemployment 24.9%. Gulcin, could it be as bad as that?
It could be as bad as that, but given the source of the crisis, following from what Steve has said, it really very much depends on where we are with the resolution of the public health crisis. Now, comparisons obviously with the 1930s doesn't give us a rosy picture, in the sense that in the 1930s, the amount of contraction in the economy, about 24-25%, it took 3 years to get there. On this occasion, really, it's about 3 months we got there. So it's very, very different. But 1930s was an altogether different set of circumstances. This might take long. It depends very much on where the resolution for the public health emergency will be. If we have one, then we might go back to normal within 2-3 years, not very, very quickly. The IMF obviously revised their growth projections for the global economy from a growth of 3.3% to a contraction of 3%. So we have at least 2-3 years before we can go back to where we would have been in 2020 in the absence of the pandemic.
And for younger people, either thinking about starting in employment or those who haven't progressed very far down that line, are we looking at a generation jobless?
The data suggests that people who come onto the job market when things are down, their lifetime chances are impacted in a permanent way. So it's not looking great. But it really, again, will all depend on how quickly we come out of the pandemic, and then how quickly we respond to it in terms of the recovery on the economy, on economic activity.
What we're going to do now is take a look at the brighter side of this, if there is one. Steve, are there opportunities in this?
Yes, well, economists do talk about creative destruction after the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. So the idea is, when you have times of change, bad, outdated businesses are destroyed, and they allow capital to be redeployed. So innovative new businesses are created. So whenever you have a crisis like this, Schumpeterian creative destruction is wheeled out as the possible silver lining. The trouble is, when it's a crisis as severe as this, you end up with the risk that there's mostly destruction and not much creation. So with that caveat, there probably are some potential avenues in which the economy could change. One thing, obviously, is the contribution to technological change. We're seeing a lot of remote office working being done, and actually it seems to be working quite well. That will stimulate innovation in these kinds of areas. Public health, enormous effort and innovation going on in public health, for example. This will stimulate various sectors of the economy. There's also a phrase, never waste a good crisis. So this could be the opportunity to do some long-term structural reform, for example, to help companies invest more and be less short-termist, rely less on fragile business models that rely on gig economy workers and not investing enough.
So everything will change, and there are some bright spots in that future if we could look that far ahead, if we had a crystal ball. Gulcin, I read something from an Australian magazine which said that in that country they reckoned hospitality, retail, transport, manufacturing, financial services, marketing and advertising, to name a few sectors, will never operate profitably again. Is it that gloomy?
It could be, again, what we need to do, look at the past data. Now, in the reason, I was earlier describing why we had what's called jobless recoveries from the global financial crisis. One of the reasons was the sectors that were at the heart of the crisis on that occasion, the finance, housing, they had permanent job losses. So this is not going to be the first time if that happened. In areas where they were initially vulnerable to the type of crisis you are exposed to, it's likely that you have some permanent losses. And indeed, they are usually the sources of this unemployment being at very high levels for an extended periods of time, leading to mismatches across the workers and the job opportunities. So it's a possibility. We cannot rule out.
Steve, I know in the past you've given advice to government departments. You may well still be doing so. So give us an idea what you think the UK government should do at the moment to make the impact of this as well, not as severe as it might be.
Well, there's lots the government could do. There's lots the government is doing. As I said, the economic package put together by the Treasury and the Bank of England is pretty sound, actually. It's throwing an awful lot of money at helping companies keep people on the payroll and keep their cash flow going.
But that can't last forever.
It can't last forever. At some point, probably quite soon, if the economy is still in the doldrums, they will need to make a choice about who you save and who you let go to the wall. That's obviously a politically very difficult decision. It implies, as you said, a bit of a crystal ball to see who's worth saving. But generally, I mean, businesses with a lot of intangible assets generally worth saving. If they go to the wall, a lot of those intangible assets, the intellectual property and the skills are lost forever. Harsh though it may seem, if a restaurant goes bust, it's bad for its customers and its staff, but you can repurpose the assets relatively easily. So I think the government needs to decide, well, what strategically do we want to preserve? What will preserve most value? What has the best chance of survival? And what are the industries of the future that we really need to be nurturing? And this is quite a brutal way of looking at it, but these are the kinds of things that governments really need to be thinking about.
Out of the ashes, perhaps. Gulcin, let me ask you, I know you're doing research at the moment and about trends, et cetera, and I wondered if you could share with us some of your thoughts on where this is going.
This is, at least for the next 2-3 years, going to be at a level that's unprecedented. There's no question about that. It's unprecedented because we don't have any previous example where governments have put the economy on ice by choice because they had to have containment and lockdown. And therefore, on any other crisis, what you would have done to stimulate the economy, you can't do on this occasion. So this is very different. Therefore, we'll have to ride through. The next 2-3 years are not looking great. But beyond that, especially if we have a successful resolution to the pandemic, we may look beyond that and hope that the structural changes, the changes to tax policy will take the economies in a better direction. I mean, better direction, what do we mean? It could be in terms of inequality, for example. One of the things pandemic has shown very clearly the importance of public health infrastructure, the importance of free access to public health services. So if there is any progress on that front, that would be a step in the right direction.
Oh, perhaps a total reevaluation of where we've been in the past and where we should go in the future. I appreciate it very much indeed. Gulcin Ozkan and Steve Coulter. Great to have you on the programme.
Thank you.
Let us welcome Ahu Yildirmaz, head economist at Labour Market Research Group, the ADP Research Institute. She's in New Jersey in the US. And in London, we say hello to Mark McDermott, the chief executive of digital signage company Screencloud. And I know, Mark, that you think the type of work that you do, or the way you do your work, is the way many of us will be working in the future. 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, all stuck in boxes as we are. We've got to adapt, haven't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're in the privileged position of being a relatively young company, only been going for 5 years, that we already moved forward with a distributed workforce that was flexible between working at home and working in offices, and we're globally spread out across the earth. And that's worked very well for us, and actually has been noted in many of our internal HR reviews as one of the main sort of benefits and privileges of working for a company like us. So it's actually been something we embraced because people want it. So the technology's been there for a while, and I think really it is now time for most companies that can adapt towards this to embrace it. And I think they'll find that there's many, many benefits beyond the obvious ones that we're faced with at the moment.
So you're talking about companies, but what about employees? What about workers? What do they have to do to be part of the digital transformation so that they are not, as we referred to them in the first part, generation jobless?
Well, I think the key thing is to become comfortable with the technology, to become just really conversant in how to use it and adapt to it, so that when you do get into the workforce, this becomes like second nature. And really, you don't necessarily have to have career experience to do that. You could just be using it in your day-to-day life. To be honest, a lot of the tools on social media, for example, are pretty similar in how the business software works as well. So I think from a kind of transition point of view for most employees, just embrace it, just get used to it, play with it and experiment with it. And then really it's kind of down to the companies to also leverage that and also give some training and a little bit of patience as people adapt and get used to it.
Ahu, let me ask you, you look into these things in some detail, you look at numbers and work out where things are going. In the first part of the program, I talked about how many people lost their jobs during the Great Recession in the late 20s and early 30s of the 20th century. Can any comparison be made here?
Yeah, this one is very different. I mean, it's different because of two reasons. One is the magnitude, and the other one is the speed of it. Magnitude, when you compare with the Great Recession, it's more than double. We lost between mid-February and mid-April, we lost more than 22 million workers in the United States. And the speed was very different because if you think about it, the peak of the unemployment usually in recessions takes 1 to 2.5 years. And in this one, everything occurred in 1 month. The speed, the magnitude, it really challenged all of us, all the economists, this recession.
Okay, the speed of it, but what about the numbers, the impact on people? Will it be as bad as that?
Well, it is, because we're talking about 30 million, more than 30, 35 million just in the United States impacted. So if you think about it's approximately, we have 150 million US workers here, we're talking about 1 in 5. And then when we look at actually even part-timers, so some of the workers are still in paycheck, but they reduce their hours. If you also add them, we're talking about 50 million employees, so 1/3 of the US workforce. But what is also very different this time is that low-wage workers really got a big hit in this downturn. Like, it's not surprising that usually in recessions, the low-wage, low-skilled workers are impacted more. But the magnitude, the difference between high-paid, high-skilled versus low-wage, low-skilled jobs this time was huge.
What is it that you mean when you refer to the negative multiplier effect in situations like this?
This is the moment now, right? We're talking about 50 million US workers being impacted. But think about the future. 70% of the US economy comes from, US GDP economy comes from the consumer spending. So we have this sudden impact today, but the wealth effect will also come into the play, and it's really going to impact not only those who lost their jobs, but also those who are still in paycheck. They're going to consume less, and this is going to really impact the overall trends and how we're going to really face what we're going to face in upcoming months.
Okay, home working. Let's take a look at some figures here from Global Workplace Analytics. This was March of this year. It refers to people working from home half the time or more in the US. Right now, don't forget this was March, 3.6% of employees. It reckoned by the end of 2021, it could be as high as 30%. And companies will like this. They can save apparently about $11,000 a year per employee, and the employees themselves can save between $2,500 and $4,000 a year. This isn't just, Mark, is it, people working entirely from home? It's what you call hybrid working.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think sometimes when we have a swift transition like this, that people tend to somewhat overreact and say, oh, we're all going to work from home now. I think in my experience, the hybrid model is essential. I think when you only work from home, it's quite possible to feel quite detached from the business and from the organization you're working for, and also for anxiety to creep up. Another issue we see is that with less experienced people in the company, they really thrive from building their network by being around others and by the osmosis effect of working with people who are that bit more experienced. So I don't think we're going to see shutdown of offices completely, but I think what we are going to see is a move towards the hybrid, which personally I think opens up opportunities for a lot more people and to also be much more flexible around things like family. So although there is definitely a horrific wave coming, and I feel terrible for all the people who are going to be affected by this, I think that there are going to be some long-term benefits, if it's not bad to be too optimistic about that, because I think it's been a long time coming, and it's something that we need to embrace more.
So the 9 to 5 may have gone, but not necessarily the office block. I'll come back to you about what governments can do, opportunities. But Ahu, let me ask you this. What opportunities do you see for institutions, for administrations, and for individuals in all of this?
It's going to be challenging because there are a lot of things that we are facing at the same time. First of all, think about this. I mean, this impacted across all industries, all business sizes, and governments are trying to chip in and did a lot of fiscal policy. But really, it's right now saving the moment. I think as a forward-looking perspective, small businesses will need more help. Because most of the sectors impacted, like leisure and hospitality, restaurants, retail, construction, these are all small firms, and they are the engine of the economy. For the recovery, it's very much important for small businesses come back and proceed where they left. But they have challenges, right? From a financial perspective, they are not as resilient as larger firms. So they will need more support, but it's very much important for them to come back. Like a lot of construction companies, restaurants, bars, and where we need to really be careful is the consumer spending, again, which feeds most of these sectors. We need to be careful. This started as a supply driven downturn. We don't want it to turn into demand repressed recession.
Mark, let me come to you. You talked about opportunities. The big thinkers within governments, the clever people, what can they do to make things happen the right way? Digital transformation acceleration, if you like.
Yeah, I think what we need to do is finally just concede that internet connectivity is like an essential utility. We should sort of be treating it like electricity, water, and things like that. And that probably would have raised a smirk a few years ago. But if we now see that that is how we're going to need to connect with each other and work together, then I think we need to raise the bar a little bit there. So I think governments need to help with making sure that everyone, regardless of their location, I know that in rural areas it can be a real problem. I've noticed this myself, where I'm in London, I have fiber optic connection, so everything's working very well. But my colleagues who work in the countryside constantly dropping out of meetings. That's going to affect them long term, and that's not really their fault. So I think we need to get the connectivity up, and then obviously we need to upskill everyone. We need to consider digital to be like literacy itself, and fold that into our education for both young people and adults as well. If I was to sort of take it a step further, I think that government should, I realize I'm talking from a position of privilege here, from someone who can work from home and effectively do my job. What we find is that obviously in the lower paid industries, often those people cannot work from home. We need to make sure that innovation is being done to make those environments as safe as possible so that people can effectively go back to do their work and not be at risk. I think government has a role to play in funding innovation projects which have that assistance so that we can help those environments get to a safe place and get to a place for the future, assuming that there's some new normality with social distancing, etc.
Thank you both very much indeed. I was smiling when you talked about internet connectivity, because here I am in the countryside and we are going to have the fibre optic man come up with his pneumatic drill at the other side of that screen down in the street fairly soon, and we may not be able to hear a single word that's coming from this office, this studio, should I say, for at least an hour or so. But we will be able to have high-speed internet. Thank you both very, very much indeed. Ahu in New Jersey and Mark in South London. Great to have you on the programme. And
Thank you.
For me, David Foster, that is everything for today. We hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.